So picture this. It's the late 1930s. You have this California oil executive, right?
Okay.
And he's just standing out there in this scorching primeval desert of the Arabian Peninsula.
Just completely out of his element.
Exactly. Sweating through his shirt, risking millions of his stockholders' dollars on this massive gamble.
Right.
And he's completely unaware that this black liquid pooling at his feet is about to entirely redraw the map of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's the ultimate butterfly effect, isn't it?
It really is.
A drill bit just pierces the bedrock in 1938, and a whole century of geopolitical chaos basically erupts from that one crater.
And, well, that is exactly what we're dissecting today. We've got this towering stack of historical research, declassified intelligence memos, and geopolitical analysis all about the modern Middle East.
It's a lot of material to get through.
It's a ton. But before we even get to the oil, I think we have to look at the map itself.
Definitely.
Because, usually when you look at the globe, for you listening, the borders kind of make intuitive sense, right?
Yeah, you see a river forming a natural boundary, or maybe a massive mountain range separating two distinct cultures.
Right, you just assume the borders grew organically over centuries, like the rings of a tree.
You expect the geography to reflect human reality.
Exactly. But then you look at the modern Middle East, and that assumption just shatters completely.
Oh, completely. We're looking at a map that wasn't grown, it was sliced up.
Sliced up, with a ruler, basically.
Yeah, it was engineered. And very poorly, I might add.
Right, because this region, this is the cradle of human civilization.
Yeah.
But the borders we see today were essentially drawn by British and French diplomats right after World War I.
Just sitting in parlors in Europe.
Literally, looking at the collapsing Ottoman Empire and just carving it up into spheres of influence.
And paying absolutely zero regard to the ethnic, religious, or linguistic realities of the people actually living on the ground there.
None at all. They just forced rival factions into single-bordered boxes. And they split unified ancient cultures across 4 different newly invented countries.
Which is really the critical context for everything we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Because when you impose arbitrary artificial borders on a deeply complex region like that, you're laying down a really fragile, somewhat reckless skeleton.
Right.
You are essentially pre-programming a century of inevitable friction.
And listener, as we navigate through this stack of sources to understand all that friction, I want to be super upfront about our approach here.
Yeah, this is important.
We are going to be hitting some highly charged topics today. We're talking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, global superpower rivalries.
These are events that draw really intense visceral reactions from people.
They do. And our job in this deep dive isn't to take a side or, tell you who the good guys or bad guys are.
Not at all.
We are just acting as your guides. We're unpacking the historical data, the mechanisms of power, and the strategies laid out in these documents.
Right. The goal here is purely synthesis. We want to show you how all these puzzle pieces fit together purely based on the historical record provided.
Exactly. We're tracing the mechanics of how the region got to where it is today. So let's jump back to that sweaty California oil executive in 1938.
Let's do it.
Because the foundation of the modern Middle East's massive geopolitical weight really begins with that single substance and the rising global superpower that came looking for it.
The 1930s is such a fascinating pivot point, really.
How so?
Well, major powers of the world are suddenly waking up to the reality that oil is the future of human civilization, and more specifically, the future of warfare.
Oh, right. Because of World War I.
Exactly. Germany had just lost the First World War in no small part because they simply lacked the petroleum to keep their mechanized forces moving. So the United States, which had spent the entire previous century looking westward, suddenly turns its gaze to the east.
And they zero in on this vast desert, roughly a third the size of the continental U.S. So this California company, which would later become Chevron, decides to roll the dice.
A massive gamble.
They go into the absolute blistering heat of the Saudi Arabian desert to explore. And it wasn't a sure thing at all, right?
No, they drilled dry hole after dry hole.
Right. But then, on March 3rd, 1938, at a site called Neom No. 7, they strike an oceanic reserve of black gold.
And the geopolitical mechanics of this discovery are just wild, because it instantly created this deeply uncomfortable collision of two completely opposing worlds.
Right, because you have the nascent nation of Saudi Arabia on one hand.
Yes. Ruled by a dogmatic, fiercely conservative royal family, Their primary source of legitimacy is their role as the ultimate guardians of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam.
Okay.
And overnight, to capitalize on this unimaginable wealth, they are opening their doors to Western, non-Muslim foreigners.
And the Americans, they didn't just quietly pump the oil and go home. They brought their entire way of life with them.
Oh, yeah. Everything.
Like throughout the 30s and 40s, American oil executives, engineers, their families, they all flocked to the desert.
And they built these massive compounds.
Yeah, these compounds that were essentially little slices of suburban America just dropped right into the Arabian dunes.
Which is so surreal to think about.
It is. We're talking air-conditioned ranch houses, manicured lawns, swimming pools, even outdoor movie theaters.
And more importantly, inside these compounds, the Americans were engaging in behaviors that were strictly forbidden by Saudi law.
Right.
They were brewing their own alcohol, throwing mixed-gender parties, and, allowing women to drive.
The cultural whiplash must have been just deafening for the locals.
Absolutely. The local population adhered to a really strict interpretation of Islamic law.
And they're just watching these foreign nationals set up these autonomous colonies and openly flaunt local religious edicts on Holy Land.
It was a massive liability for the Saudi royal family. The local clerics were outraged, but the volume of oil flowing out of the ground was generating a level of wealth that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire nation.
So the money was just too good to stop.
Exactly. And it gets to the point where the relationship deepens beyond just commerce. It shifts into national security.
Oh, right.
The United States government realizes this oil is critical to their own national interests. So they approached the Saudi royals with a proposal: let us build a permanent U.S. military base in Dhahran to protect the oil fields.
And the Saudis agree, but they understand exactly how explosive this looks to their own people, right?
Very much so.
So they attach this massive, very telling caveat to the agreement. They tell the U.S. military, you cannot fly an American flag on a flagpole anywhere on this base.
Yeah, the optics of a foreign, non-Muslim military flag flying over the Arabian Peninsula was simply a bridge too far.
They were just terrified of the domestic reaction.
Yep.
So the U.S. was only allowed to bolt a small, discrete metal plaque to the side of a building to designate the base.
Just a plaque.
It's like this massive corporate merger where the two CEOs fundamentally despise each other's personal morals, but they need the monopoly so badly they just pretend not to notice.
That's a great analogy.
It's like a forbidden bromance. They're essentially keeping the relationship a secret from the board of directors.
A forbidden bromance built purely on wealth. And the neighbors were absolutely judging them too.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Other nations in the region were looking at the Saudi royals and questioning how the guardians of Mecca could be in bed with a Western imperial power.
Okay, wait. I'm struggling with the logic here for a second.
Sure.
If the Saudi royals derive all their legitimacy from being the strict religious guardians of the Holy Land, allowing a foreign military base is a massive hypocrisy.
It is.
So why didn't the powerful local clerics just incite a revolt right then and there? How do the royals survive that cognitive dissonance? Was the influx of cash just effectively buying everyone's silence? Or was there a genuine strategic fear driving this?
It was a very calculated survival mechanism.
Okay.
The wealth was a huge part of it, yes. They were rapidly modernizing a nomadic society with unprecedented infrastructure. But the strategic fear was very real and very existential.
What were they afraid of?
Well, as we move into the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War is heating up. The Soviet Union is actively, aggressively trying to expand its influence into the Middle East. They're backing socialist, secular, and revolutionary movements that explicitly wanted to topple monarchies.
So the Saudis are looking around the region, they're seeing monarchies falling in places like Egypt and Iraq, and they realize they need a bodyguard.
Precisely. They needed an absolute ironclad protector against external threats, and the U.S. had the biggest military in the world.
Makes sense.
So the Saudi royals prioritized their regime's survival over the immediate cultural friction. But that friction didn't just evaporate. It went underground and it fermented.
Which introduces one of the most consequential figures in this entire history.
Yes.
Because to build all this massive new infrastructure, the American oil compounds, the military air bases, the highways, the Americans needed local contractors.
Right.
So they hired this massive, rapidly growing construction company founded by a man named Mohammed bin Laden.
Mohammed bin Laden is a fascinating figure. He leverages this relationship with the state and the Americans into an absolute empire.
Wow.
He becomes one of the wealthiest non-royals in the kingdom. He eventually has 22 wives and 54 children.
54.
54 children.
And one of those 54 children, born into this incomprehensible wealth, is a boy named Osama bin Laden.
Osama grows up in the 1970s surrounded by this immense privilege, but he is fundamentally shaped by the ideological friction we just talked about.
Okay.
He looks at this deeply intertwined relationship between his family's construction empire, the Saudi royal family, and the United States government, and he is repulsed by it.
He views the presence of American forces in Western culture as a desecration of the Holy Lands.
Yes.
And this wasn't just some teenage rebellion phase. When the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, Osama sees an opportunity to actually do something about superpowers invading Muslim lands.
He leaves his life of luxury behind.
He travels to Afghanistan and joins the Mujahideen rebel fighters.
And he doesn't just bring himself. He brings his family's deep pockets and his inherited knowledge of heavy construction and logistics.
Right, because of the family business.
Exactly. He is literally bringing in bulldozers to carve complex cave systems and fortified bunkers into the Afghan mountains.
And here's the jaw-dropping irony of the Cold War.
It really is.
The United States government is secretly thrilled that the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan, because they want Moscow to get bogged down in an unwinnable quagmire.
It was their chance to give the Soviets their own Vietnam.
Exactly. So the CIA starts funneling massive amounts of money and advanced weapons like Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen.
Secretly, of course.
Right. So they are actively, secretly funding and arming the very network of fighters that Osama bin Laden is helping to organize.
It is a profound failure of long-term vision. The U.S. was so focused on the immediate tactical goal of bleeding the Soviet Union that they completely ignored the ideological fire they were pouring gasoline on.
Wow. And after 10 brutal years, it works. The Soviets withdraw in defeat, and Osama bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia in 1989. He's a hero to many, battle-hardened, and wholly dedicated to his new organization, Al-Qaeda.
And their explicit mission is to protect the Muslim world by violently striking back against foreign interference.
But the true breaking point with his own country happens a year later.
Right.
In 1990, when Saddam Hussein invades neighboring Kuwait.
Right. Suddenly, the massive Iraqi army is sitting right on the Saudi border. The Saudi royal family is terrified.
Understandably.
So Osama bin Laden goes to the royals and offers to mobilize his battle-hardened Afghan veterans to defend the kingdom. He insists that they must not rely on non-Muslim forces.
And the royals, who were heavily reliant on their superpower bodyguard, basically laugh him out of the room.
Yeah, they dismiss him completely.
Instead, they invite U.S. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney in, and they agree to allow hundreds of thousands of American troops onto Saudi soil to launch Operation Desert Storm.
For Osama bin Laden, this was the ultimate betrayal. The guardians of the Holy Land had chosen the great Satan over their own people.
That decision just finalized his radicalization. He turns his entire logistical network, his wealth, and his fighters against the United States and the Saudi state.
Eventually culminating in the horrific tragedy of September 11th.
It is the ultimate lesson in how early, cynical alliances can mutate into uncontrollable threats.
Truly.
But, Osama bin Laden's radicalization was just one localized reaction to foreign interference. To really understand the wider regional instability, all the massive fault lines that define the Middle East today, we have to look at what happened in 1979, right next door in Iran.
Because 1979 wasn't just the year the Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
Right.
It was the year the entire tectonic structure of the Middle East cracked in half.
So we're moving from a battle purely over oil and Cold War posturing into a terrifying existential battle between religious revolution and the established status quo.
Let's look at the mechanics of this. Up until 1979, Iran was ruled by the Shah. He was an authoritarian monarch who was massively backed by the United States.
And we should probably note the context there, right?
Oh, definitely.
Because the U.S. and the U.K. had actually orchestrated a coup back in 1953 to overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
Primarily because he wanted to nationalize the country's oil reserves, taking them out of British control.
Right. So they installed the Shah to ensure a steady flow of oil and keep a pro-Western ally on the Soviet border.
But the Shah's regime was notoriously brutal. His secret police, the Savak, tortured dissidents. And his aggressive Western-style modernization programs deeply alienated the conservative, religious working class.
And this resentment finally boils over in 1979 in a massive, overwhelming popular revolution.
The Shah flees the country.
And Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns from exile to establish an Islamic republic.
This is a seismic shock to the global system. Khomeini establishes a fiercely anti-Western, anti-American theocracy.
The U.S. embassy is overrun, hostages are taken, and Iran goes from being America's premier ally in the region to its most vocal adversary.
But it wasn't just America that was terrified.
Really? Who else?
Well, Khomeini starts actively broadcasting messages across the region, openly urging the citizens of neighboring countries to rise up.
Oh, wow.
Specifically targeting conservative Sunni monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the secular dictatorship of Iraq. He wanted them to overthrow their leaders and replicate the Iranian Revolution.
You have to imagine the sheer panic in the palaces of Riyadh and Baghdad.
Oh, absolute panic.
These leaders are watching an entrenched, heavily armed, U.S.-backed monarch get swept away by a popular religious uprising in a matter of months. They are deeply afraid the contagion will spread to their own populations.
Which brings us to Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq. Saddam looks at Iran in 1980, and the country is in absolute chaos following the revolution.
The military leadership has been purged, the economy is reeling.
Exactly. He sees a fractured neighbor, and he sees an opportunity for a massive power grab.
So what was his actual goal?
Saddam had two main goals. First, a quick territorial grab. He wanted to seize control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a critical shipping route for oil, and annex the oil-rich Khuzestan province of Iran.
Okay, classic resource grab.
And second, he desperately wanted to crush the Iranian Revolution before Khomeini could successfully incite the Shia majority living inside Iraq to rise up against Saddam's Sunni-dominated government.
So in September 1980, Saddam launches a massive surprise invasion of Iran. And he thinks it's going to be a walk in the park, a swift victory.
But his geopolitical calculation was disastrously flawed.
It backfired.
Totally. Instead of collapsing, the Iranian people rallied behind the new revolutionary government. The invasion actually consolidated Khomeini's power and unified the country against a foreign invader.
And the conflict evolves into an absolute nightmare. The Iran-Iraq War becomes one of the longest and deadliest conventional wars of the 20th century.
We're talking about conditions that mirror the darkest days of World War I.
Stagnant trench warfare, hundreds of miles of barbed wire, flooded battlefields.
The mechanics of the fighting were horrific. Because Iraq had superior firepower and air support, Iran relied on its massive population advantage.
Which means?
They utilized human wave attacks. They would literally send thousands of lightly armed young men and often teenage boys wearing plastic keys to paradise around their necks, charging across open minefields.
God, that's awful.
Just to clear the way for the regular army, running directly into Iraqi machine gun fire and artillery.
It is unimaginable carnage. And this is where the global superpowers decide to get involved in the most cynical way imaginable.
Yeah, this is where it gets really dark.
You have the Cold War going on. The U.S. and the Soviet Union hate each other. But when they look at this horrific meat grinder of a war, they actually find themselves on the same side.
Both Washington and Moscow end up actively backing Saddam Hussein.
It wasn't because they particularly liked Saddam, right?
Not at all. It was pure containment strategy. Neither superpower wanted Iran's anti-Western, anti-Soviet, deeply unpredictable religious revolution to win and spread across the Middle East.
Right.
They both decided that the status quo of Saddam's secular dictatorship was vastly preferable to an Iranian victory.
It's like a casino pit boss who is secretly lending chips to both players at the table just to make sure neither of them actually leaves the building with a win.
That's a brutal way to look at it, but very accurate. They just wanted Iran and Iraq to bleed each other completely dry.
And that cynical strategy reached its absolute moral nadir regarding the use of chemical weapons.
Yes, it did.
As the war dragged on, Saddam Hussein became increasingly desperate to break the Iranian human wave attacks. So he began deploying chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas and the nerve agent sarin.
Against Iranian troops.
Which is a profound violation of international law. We're talking about weapons that cause blindness, horrific blistering of the skin, and agonizing asphyxiation.
And the global powers, specifically the United States, knew exactly what he was doing.
They did.
They did. Declassified intelligence shows the U.S. government was fully aware of the scale of the chemical attacks. Yet, they not only turned a blind eye, they actively increased their support for Saddam.
That's unbelievable.
The Reagan administration restored official diplomatic ties, provided critical satellite intelligence to the Iraqi military to target Iranian troop formations, and even authorized the export of dual-use technology and chemicals.
Wait, chemicals that Saddam used to further develop those very weapons programs?
Yes.
Okay, I have to stop on that point for a second.
Yes.
Because the sheer hypocrisy here is staggering.
It really is.
The U.S. is publicly backing Saddam Hussein. They are sharing intelligence with him. They are actively ignoring his use of banned chemical weapons because they want him to defeat Iran. But at the exact same time, the Reagan administration is secretly selling advanced anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran.
Yes. This is the heart of the infamous Iran-Contra scandal.
This completely breaks the brain. Why on earth would the U.S. arm the very revolution they are trying to contain?
Well, it is the ultimate example of complex, contradictory foreign policy. The Reagan administration had hostages being held in Lebanon by Iranian proxy groups.
Oh,
They secretly reasoned that selling arms to Iran might incentivize Tehran to pressure their proxies to release the hostages.
so it's a hostage negotiation tactic.
Right. And furthermore, the U.S. administration then took the millions of dollars in proceeds from those secret Iranian arms sales and illegally freed it to fund a right-wing rebel group called the Contras in Nicaragua.
Right, the Iran-Contra affair.
Deliberately bypassing a U.S. congressional ban on such funding.
The audacity of that operation is just wild. But looking at the map, looking at the Middle East, you are publicly funding Saddam's chemical war machine and secretly shipping missiles to the Ayatollahs. Doesn't this completely shatter the illusion that superpower foreign policy in the region was ever about human rights or good versus evil?
It absolutely shatters it. The primary motivation was managing chaos.
Just pure, terrifying mechanics of power.
Exactly. But we have to look at the long-term fallout of this 8-year war. Because the Iran-Iraq War is the crucible that forged the modern psychology of the region. Nearly 1 million people died.
So let's unpack the psychological damage there. How does Iran walk away from this?
For Iran, the war cemented a deeply ingrained, almost paranoid worldview that persists to this day.
A paranoid worldview.
Yes. The Iranian leadership and population felt completely validated in their belief that the entire outside world was fundamentally untrustworthy and actively bent on their destruction.
I mean, they were attacked with horrific chemical weapons, and the United Nations, the U.S., and Europe essentially watched and did nothing.
Exactly. That trauma doesn't just go away. It became the foundational justification for their modern security strategy.
Okay.
That feeling of total isolation led directly to their pursuit of a nuclear program as the ultimate untouchable deterrent. And because their conventional military was devastated, it led them to develop the strategy of funding and arming asymmetrical proxy militias across the region, groups like Hezbollah, to fight their enemies beyond their own borders.
And what about Saddam Hussein? He survives the war, but at what cost?
He emerges in 1988 claiming victory, but in reality, Iraq is completely battered. He has an enormous battle-hardened army, but his economy is in ruins.
And he's in massive debt, right?
Massively, cripplingly in debt to countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who had loaned him billions of dollars to fight the war.
And Saddam's logic is, I just spent 8 years sacrificing a generation of Iraqi men to act as a shield protecting your monarchies from the Iranian Revolution. You owe me. Forgive the debt.
Exactly. And when Kuwait refuses to forgive the debt and refuses to lower oil production to help raise global prices, Saddam feels betrayed.
So he just takes it.
Right. In 1990, just 2 years after the war with Iran ends, he sends his massive army across the border and invades Kuwait to simply take their oil wealth by force.
Which, as we discussed earlier with Osama bin Laden, triggers the massive U.S. military response in Operation Desert Storm. The U.S. expels Saddam from Kuwait, severely degrades his military, and suddenly, America's former proxy, the man they armed to fight Iran, becomes global public enemy #1.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next massive tectonic shift in the region. Saddam's usefulness as a bulwark against Iran had expired, and he became a lingering, unpredictable liability.
And that brings us to the tragedy of 2003. And what the source material points to is a profound failure of institutional truth.
This is a huge turning point.
Let's fast forward to the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. The United States has suffered a horrific terrorist attack orchestrated by al-Qaeda. The nation is traumatized. The Bush administration is reeling.
Right.
And according to the historical analysis we're looking at, the administration felt a desperate, overarching need to project unassailable global power. They needed a massive theater to remind the world who was in charge.
The primary documents from this period are incredibly revealing.
What do they say?
Just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, when it was clear Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan was responsible, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is already taking notes about building momentum to topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Wait, why Iraq? They had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11.
Well, Rumsfeld explicitly wrote in his notes that they needed to bomb something else to show that we're, big and strong and not going to be pushed around by these kinds of attacks.
Really? That was the logic?
Yes. The Taliban in Afghanistan didn't present a large enough conventional military target to demonstrate overwhelming American might. Saddam Hussein, their former proxy, who is now internationally isolated and weakened by a decade of sanctions, presented the perfect stage for demonstration of power.
So a decision for regime change was being cemented behind closed doors long before the public was aware.
Yes, and the definitive proof of this timeline came out years later in a massive leak known as the Downing Street Memo.
Right. This is a crucial piece of the historical puzzle.
Right.
In the summer of 2002, Richard Dearlove, who is the head of British intelligence, MI6, travels to Washington.
He has extensive meetings with the director of the CIA and top administration officials.
Then he flies back to London to brief the UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair, on what the Americans are planning. And the memo recording that briefing is terrifying to read.
It really is.
Dearlove tells the Prime Minister that the U.S. saw an invasion of Iraq as inevitable. But the chilling part is the exact phrasing he uses. He reports back that in Washington, the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy.
Fixed around the policy? That phrase is a devastating indictment of the bureaucratic process. It means the conclusion invading Iraq had already been decided.
Wow.
The intelligence agencies were then expected to work backward to find or manufacture the justifications required to sell that conclusion.
So the administration was essentially running a dual narrative. Privately, the core motivation was projecting power and reshaping the Middle East in a post-9/11 world. But publicly, they knew that we want to show we are big and strong isn't a legal or acceptable justification for a preemptive war.
So they launched what Rumsfeld internally called an influence campaign. It was a coordinated effort to sell the war to the American public, the U.S. Congress, and the international community.
It's essentially the darkest possible version of corporate storytelling. They built a multi-billion-dollar, high-stakes marketing campaign where the core product they were selling didn't actually exist.
Yeah.
They hammered the public with two absolute terrifying certainties. First, that Saddam Hussein was actively harboring and colluding with al-Qaeda terrorists.
And second, that he was aggressively amassing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, specifically nuclear and biological weapons that could be deployed at a moment's notice.
And they presented these as indisputable facts, even when their own internal intelligence analysts were screaming the opposite.
That's the craziest part. In September 2002, the Joint Chiefs of Staff circulated an internal report assessing the intelligence on Iraq's WMDs. That report explicitly warned that the conclusion that Saddam possessed these weapons relied heavily on analytic assumptions and judgments rather than hard evidence.
Okay, wait. I need to stop and ask a fundamental question here about how governments function.
Go ahead.
If you have an internal intelligence report literally saying, hey, we are just guessing, we don't have hard proof, how does an entire massive government bureaucracy override that truth? Was this just a tragic case of groupthink where everyone was too scared after 9/11 to be wrong, or was it deliberate deception?
It was a toxic combination of both. Driven from the top down, the administration applied immense political pressure on the intelligence agencies.
So they were pressured into it.
Yeah, when Congress demanded a formal national intelligence estimate before voting on the war, the CIA rushed to produce a massive report in less than 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
It's less than 3 weeks. To hit the deadline and please the administration, they relied heavily on groupthink. They utilized severely outdated intelligence from before 1998, and they heavily sourced information from Iraqi exiles who had a vested personal interest in seeing Saddam overthrown.
So they systematically stripped out the nuance and the dissenting opinions from the final document.
Exactly. And they completely steamrolled the international community in the process.
Because the United Nations was deeply skeptical, right?
Very. So they sent in their chief weapons inspector, Hans Blix, to scour the country. Blix and his teams conducted over 900 rigorous inspections at 500 different sites across Iraq.
900 inspections.
They went to military bases, underground bunkers, presidential palaces, universities. They demanded access everywhere.
And what did they find?
Nothing. Zero evidence of an active WMD program, no biological weapons factories, no hidden nuclear centrifuges.
Yet the U.S. administration took minor accounting discrepancies in Blitch's report, things like missing paperwork from the 1980s, and used them as definitive proof that Saddam was hiding a massive arsenal.
This culminates in February 2003, when Secretary of State Colin Powell goes before the UN Security Council.
Powell's speech is a masterclass in the presentation of flawed data.
Oh, absolutely.
He played intercepted audio tapes that were highly ambiguous, presenting them as clear evidence of concealment. He showed satellite photographs of what he claimed were decontamination vehicles.
Which were actually just water trucks.
Right. And most infamously, he presented detailed sketches and models of mobile biological weapons laboratories trucks driving around the desert brewing anthrax.
And we know now that those mobile labs never existed. The primary source for that intelligence was a German informant codenamed Curveball.
Curveball.
Yeah, and German intelligence had already flagged him as a fabricator and a drunk. But the U.S. intelligence apparatus ignored those warnings because Curveball's lies perfectly fit the policy they were trying to sell.
So the invasion went forward in March 2003. The Iraqi military collapsed in weeks. But the subsequent occupation turned into a grueling, horrific insurgency.
The human cost is staggering. Estimates suggest up to 500,000 Iraqi deaths resulting from the invasion and the years of sectarian violence that followed.
And, as history definitively proved, absolutely zero WMDs or operational links to al-Qaeda were ever found.
Colin Powell would later call his UN presentation a scarlet chapter in his career.
We have to look at the mechanics of the fallout here. What is the long-term impact of a superpower acting on fabricated intelligence?
The geopolitical damage is almost incalculable. First, it deeply, perhaps permanently, eroded global trust in U.S. intelligence and foreign policy.
Right.
When you burn your credibility on that scale, it becomes incredibly difficult to build international coalitions for genuine threats in the future.
But practically, on the ground in the Middle East, what happened?
On the ground, decapitating the Iraqi government and dismantling its military overnight created a massive, chaotic power vacuum. It unleashed decades of suppressed sectarian tension between Sunnis and Shias.
It just lit off everything.
Exactly. It turned Iraq into a training ground for a new generation of extremists. The remnants of Saddam's military leadership eventually merged with radical jihadist groups in the chaos of U.S. prison camps, directly leading to the formation and the catastrophic rise of ISIS a decade later.
Which is the perfect tragic segue. Because when superpowers smash governments, invade countries, and shatter the fragile borders we talked about at the beginning of this deep dive, the people who get crushed the hardest in those tectonic shifts are the ones who never had a state to begin with.
The stateless populations.
Exactly. Which brings us to the deeply complex, deeply tragic story of the Kurdish people. If you want to understand how geopolitics uses and discards human beings, you have to look at the Kurds.
The Kurds are a distinct ancient ethnic group with their own language, culture, and centuries-long shared identity. They primarily inhabit a massive, mountainous region where the borders of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran converge.
So let's go back to those maps drawn by the British and French after World War I. When the European powers defeated the Ottoman Empire, there was an initial treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, that actually promised the Kurds an independent state, Kurdistan.
But geopolitics shifted quickly. A new, fierce nationalist leader emerged in Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk.
Yeah.
He pushed the European forces out and demanded a renegotiation. The European powers, exhausted by war, simply caved. They abandoned the promise of Kurdistan.
So you just erased it.
Yeah, in the new treaty, instead of drawing borders around the Kurdish population to create a state, they drew the new national borders straight through the Zagros Mountains, fracturing the Kurdish population across 4 newly invented countries.
And the mechanics of what happens next are brutal. Because these 4 new countries, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, they were all desperately trying to centralize their power and forge unified, homogeneous national identities out of the ashes of an empire.
Right.
And a distinct, fiercely independent mountain culture living within their borders was viewed as a massive threat to that centralization.
So the Kurds faced systemic, brutal oppression everywhere they lived. Let's look at Turkey. The Turkish government launched a massive Turkification campaign. They essentially tried to legally erase Kurdish identity.
How did they do that?
They outlawed the Kurdish language in public. They banned Kurdish music and traditional dress. They even went so far as to ban the use of the letters Q, W, and X simply because those letters exist in the Kurdish alphabet but not the Turkish one.
Wow, so when you try to erase a culture's identity by outlying their alphabet, you are guaranteeing a violent reaction.
Absolutely. And that reaction birthed the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a militant group that launched a decades-long, incredibly bloody insurgency against the Turkish state, seeking autonomy.
And in Syria, the mechanics of oppression were different but equally devastating. In the 1960s, the Syrian government conducted a census and intentionally stripped hundreds of thousands of Kurds of their citizenship overnight.
They became stateless ghosts in their own homes,
unable to own property, travel, or legally marry, while the government confiscated their arable land and gave it to Arab settlers.
And in Iraq, the oppression escalated to outright genocide. We already talked about Saddam Hussein.
Right.
During the final stages of the Iran-Iraq War, Kurdish rebel groups saw an opportunity to fight for autonomy while Saddam was distracted. Saddam's retaliation was apocalyptic.
The chemical weapons.
Yes. In 1988, he ordered his Air Force to drop those very same chemical weapons, mustard gas, and nerve agents on the Kurdish town of Halabja. Survivors described smelling sweet apples just before the gas hit.
That's terrifying.
Because chemical gas is heavy, it sank into the basements and cellars where families were hiding. Over 5,000 civilians were killed in a matter of hours.
But what makes the Kurdish narrative so uniquely tragic on the global stage is how every major power, both inside and outside the region, has cynically weaponized their desperate fight for survival.
They really are the ultimate geopolitical multi-tool.
Multi-tool? Yeah. A superpower realizes they have a problem in the Middle East that requires a fierce, capable ground force. They reach into their pocket, pull out the Kurds, arm them, use them to fight the proxy war, and the second the objective is achieved, they toss the multi-tool back into the dirt.
It is a documented historical pattern. During the Cold War, the Soviets backed Kurdish rebels to destabilize the U.S. allied government in Iran.
Right.
Later, Syria actively provided safe haven to the PKK to bleed their rival, Turkey. During the Iran-Iraq War, both Iran and Iraq armed rival Kurdish factions across the border to weaken each other.
And the United States has arguably the most extensive track record of this exact cyclical betrayal.
Yes.
Let's look at the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War. The U.S. has just decimated Saddam's army. President George H.W. Bush goes on radio and explicitly calls for the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam.
And the Kurds in the north hear that call. They assume, logically, that if the President of the United States is asking them to rebel, the U.S. military will provide air cover. So they rise up, they take control of several northern cities.
And what does the U.S. do?
They do absolutely nothing. The Bush administration decides that a fractured Iraq is too dangerous for regional stability, so they ground their fighter jets and watch as Saddam Hussein sends his surviving helicopter gunships to mercilessly slaughter the Kurdish rebellion, forcing millions to flee, freezing into the mountains.
And incredibly, the exact same cycle repeated itself just a few years ago.
Yes, with ISIS.
Right. When the terrorist group ISIS surged across Syria and Iraq in 2014, taking over massive swaths of territory and declaring a caliphate, the U.S. military was desperate. They didn't want to put American boots on the ground, but they needed a capable local force to fight ISIS.
So they turned to the Syrian Kurds, specifically the YPG militia, who were already fighting ISIS for their own survival.
Okay.
But the U.S. military realizes it's politically awkward to openly arm a group that has historical ties to the PKK, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. So, as U.S. Special Operations commanders later admitted, they literally asked the Syrian Kurds to rebrand themselves.
They slap a new label on the multi-tool. They tell them to call themselves the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF.
Exactly. Under this new banner, the U.S. heavily arms them and provides massive air support. And the Kurds do the dying.
They did all the heavy lifting.
They fight block by block, city by city, taking immense casualties, and they successfully dismantle the ISIS caliphate on behalf of the world.
But once the caliphate is defeated, the geopolitical calculus shifts again. In 2019, the U.S. administration abruptly announces a sudden withdrawal of American troops from the Syrian border regions.
Which was the only thing preventing Turkey, a critical NATO ally that the U.S. wanted to appease, from attacking those very same Kurdish forces.
The withdrawal effectively served as a green light. Within days, Turkey launched a massive cross-border offensive, using artillery and airstrikes to bomb the very Kurdish fighters who had just defeated ISIS for the Americans, displacing hundreds of thousands of civilians.
The betrayal was so stark that even U.S. military commanders on the ground publicly expressed their disgust and shame.
So I have a very serious question about the psychology of this.
Okay.
We see this exact brutal pattern repeat decade after decade. If the Kurdish leadership knows, based on an entire century of historical evidence, that they are inevitably going to be abandoned or betrayed, why do they keep answering the phone? When the CIA or the Pentagon calls and says, hey, we have a common enemy, let's team up, why don't the Kurds just hang up?
It's a completely rational question, but it requires understanding the brutal mechanics of being stateless.
Okay.
For people without a recognized country, surrounded on all sides by powerful sovereign governments that actively seek to erase your culture or assimilate you by force, you do not have the luxury of long-term strategic pride.
So it's purely day-to-day survival.
Exactly. Any leverage is better than certain annihilation. If a superpower offers you weapons, funding, and temporary autonomy today, you take it because it means your culture survives for another year.
Wow.
You know the betrayal is coming, but the alternative is facing Turkish drones or ISIS executioners with nothing but light rifles. Their relentless willingness to fight is tied to a desperate, undying dream of cultural preservation. They are caught in a permanent state of vulnerability, making them incredibly susceptible to actors who view them merely as disposable assets.
And this tragic theme, using vulnerable populations, managing chaos, and attempting to manipulate proxies to achieve strategic goals, it leads us directly into one of the most fraught, emotionally charged conflicts in the entire region, the paradox of security.
Yes, we are transitioning to the historical analysis of Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Lebanon. And again, a reminder to you listening, we are examining the geopolitical mechanics and strategies detailed in the source material, completely independent of taking any moral or political side.
Let's lay out the foundation here. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was fundamentally driven by a singular, overriding imperative providing absolute security and self-determination for the Jewish people.
Right.
This is in the immediate wake of centuries of horrific, systemic global persecution, culminating in the unimaginable trauma of the Holocaust. The core mandate of the state is that the Jewish people must have a secure homeland to survive.
Following the 1967 Six-Day War, where Israel preemptively defeated the surrounding Arab armies, the map changed dramatically. Israel captured and occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula.
And fast forward through decades of conflict to the 1990s, and we see the most significant, genuine attempt to resolve this deeply entrenched friction, the Oslo Accords.
There was a moment where Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn.
It seemed like a breakthrough.
It did. The framework established the Palestinian Authority, granting them limited self-governance in pockets of the West Bank and Gaza, with the implied goal of moving toward a two-state solution.
But peace processes threatened the extremes on both sides. The push for a two-state solution was met with violent, intense backlash from hardliners.
From both sides.
Right. Palestinian extremist groups, notably Hamas, launched devastating suicide bombing campaigns against Israeli civilians to derail the process. Simultaneously, right-wing Israeli factions held massive, virulent rallies, branding Prime Minister Rabin a traitor for agreeing to concede any biblical land.
And that internal vitriol resulted in tragedy. In 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated at a peace rally.
Not by a Palestinian militant, but by a far-right Israeli extremist.
Yes. That assassination effectively broke the back of the peace movement. It shifted the political trajectory of Israel, eventually bringing leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu to lasting power, who operated on a fundamentally different worldview regarding how to achieve security.
So the source material focuses heavily on the mechanics of Netanyahu's long-term strategy, which was essentially a modern implementation of divide and conquer.
The analysis highlights a revealing diplomatic cable from 2007.
What's in the cable?
In it, the head of Israeli military intelligence tells the U.S. ambassador that the Israeli government would actually be satisfied and perhaps even encouraged if the extremist group Hamas took full control of the Gaza Strip.
Wait, let's look at the mechanics of that. Why on earth would an Israeli security official want a radical extremist group whose founding charter explicitly calls for the destruction of Israel to consolidate power right on their border? That sounds completely counterintuitive to national security.
It relies on a deeply cynical political calculus. A divided enemy is a weak enemy.
Oh, I see.
If Hamas takes control of Gaza, which they violently did in 2007, and the more moderate, internationally recognized Palestinian Authority remains in control of the West Bank, the Palestinian leadership is fundamentally fractured.
So they can't present a unified front.
Precisely. If there is no unified Palestinian leadership, there is no credible partner for a comprehensive peace treaty. And if there is no peace treaty, there is no pressure to establish a Palestinian state.
Wow.
Leaked audio recordings of Netanyahu speaking to Israeli settlers corroborate this mindset. He admits that his goal was to sabotage the Oslo framework and prevent the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state at all costs.
So having Hamas in power in Gaza provided the perfect pretext. It allowed the Israeli government to rightfully point to Gaza and say, we cannot negotiate with terrorists.
Right.
It allowed them to impose a severe, crippling blockade on the Gaza Strip, effectively sealing off its borders, airspace, and coastline. And strategically, it bought the government time to rapidly and systematically expand illegal Israeli settlements throughout the West Bank, making a contiguous Palestinian state physically impossible.
And how did they deal with the immediate security threat of Hamas sitting in Gaza? They relied on a strategy colloquially known as mowing the grass.
Which is such a clinical, terrifying term. Let's explain what that actually means.
Mowing the grass assumes that the underlying conflict cannot be solved, only managed.
Okay.
It means accepting that Hamas will periodically build up its rocket arsenal and fire into Israel. When that happens, the Israeli military responds with overwhelming, devastating force airstrikes and limited ground incursions into Gaza to destroy the infrastructure, kill the leadership, and degrade their capabilities for a few years.
Just pushing them back.
Once the grass is cut, you retreat behind the blockade and wait for it to grow back.
It's a strategy based entirely on managing a violent status quo. I think of it like intentionally maintaining a controlled forest fire.
A controlled forest fire.
Yeah. You know, the brush is highly flammable, so every few years you drop incendiary bombs to burn off the excess fuel. You assume that your fire lines, the blockade, the Iron Dome missile defense system are foolproof.
You think you can contain it?
Right. You think you can manage the burns perfectly, allowing you to build your house safely on the adjoining property. But you are completely ignoring the fact that you are living next to an inferno. And all it takes is one unexpected shift in the wind for the fire to jump the line and burn your house down.
That is an incredibly apt way to visualize it. And that catastrophic shift in the wind happened on October 7th, 2023.
It did.
Hamas launched an unprecedented, highly coordinated, and brutally lethal assault across the border. They shattered the physical and technological barriers, massacring civilians and taking hundreds of hostages.
It completely broke the illusion. If you are a strategist looking at this objectively, the events of October 7th prove that intentionally propping up, or at least tolerating, a radical group to achieve political division is a catastrophic failure of a security measure.
It demonstrates the dangerous allure of the short-term tactical advantage. Leaders often prioritize immediate political goals, like preventing a unified Palestinian negotiating bloc to allow for West Bank settlement expansion over long-term strategic reality.
It creates a tragic, self-defeating cycle.
Exactly. The very tactics used to try and enforce security imposing a crushing blockade, regular military bombardments, and proxy manipulation generate the exact conditions of despair and radicalization that eventually shatter that security in the most horrific way possible.
And the terrifying part is that we see this exact same dynamic of unintended consequences, this blowback from tactical interventions, playing out simultaneously just to the north in Lebanon.
Right. To understand the threat Israel faces on its northern border today, we have to look back to 1982.
What happened then?
Israel launched a massive invasion into Lebanon. Their goal was straightforward. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, had relocated to Lebanon and was launching cross-border attacks into northern Israel. Israel wanted to root them out and destroy their infrastructure.
But military invasions rarely stay confined to their original objectives, right?
Almost never.
The Israeli military pushed deep into Lebanese territory, specifically occupying the southern region of the country, which is heavily populated by Shia Muslims.
And this local Shia population was suddenly living under a foreign military occupation. Their villages were caught in the crossfire, their economy was ruined, and they were deeply marginalized.
Which creates a massive vacuum of anger and desperation. And who's watching this closely? Iran.
Yep.
Iran, fresh off its 1979 Islamic Revolution, sees a golden opportunity to export its ideology and strike at Israel without risking a direct war.
So Iran begins funneling money, weapons, and Revolutionary Guard trainers into southern Lebanon. They find a receptive audience among the marginalized Shia population.
And they help organize them.
They help organize, arm, and fund a new local militia dedicated to violently resisting the Israeli occupation.
That militia became Hezbollah.
Exactly. Hezbollah, which means the Party of God, gained immense local legitimacy because they were the ones actively fighting the occupying Israeli army. Over the course of a bloody 18-year guerrilla war, they inflicted enough casualties to eventually force Israel to unilaterally withdraw from southern Lebanon in the year 2000.
So Iran's proxy strategy worked perfectly. But Hezbollah didn't disarm after the Israelis left.
No, they didn't.
With continuous, massive Iranian backing over the last 40 years, they have morphed from a ragtag guerrilla militia into what is essentially a massive, highly sophisticated conventional army operating outside the control of the Lebanese state.
Today, they possess an arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and precision-guided missiles aimed directly at Israel. They are a deeply entrenched political party in Lebanon, and they are the crown jewel of Iran's proxy network.
And as we see in the aftermath of October 7th, they have been trading heavy, sustained fire with Israel, forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of civilians on both sides of the border, and constantly threatening to ignite a full-blown, devastating two-front war.
Which perfectly illustrates the overarching theme we keep hitting. Tactical military interventions almost always plant the seeds for the next generation's conflict.
Right, you invade Lebanon to solve a PLO problem, and you accidentally birth Hezbollah, an exponentially more dangerous threat.
And the ripple effects of October 7th and this Iranian proxy network didn't stay contained to the borders of Israel and Lebanon.
Where else did they go?
When the conflict ignited, it activated Iran's entire regional web of influence, pulling the global economy straight into the crosshairs.
Which brings us to the modern choke points of the global economy. We are moving down the map, away from the Mediterranean to one of the most vital economic arteries on planet Earth, the Red Sea. And the story here starts in a deeply fractured, impoverished country on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen.
Yemen's modern history is a complex web of civil wars and shifting alliances. But to understand the current crisis, we have to look at a specific demographic, the Zaidi Shia Muslims, who historically lived in the rugged, mountainous regions of northern Yemen.
Now let's clarify the mechanics here. Zaidi Shia is a distinct branch of Shia Islam different from the Twelver Shia majority in Iran. They had ruled Yemen for 1,000 years under an imamate, but they were overthrown in the 1960s. By the 1990s, they were feeling deeply marginalized by the central Yemeni government.
And they were increasingly alarmed by the creeping influence of hardline Sunni Wahhabism being exported by their massive neighbor to the north, Saudi Arabia.
Right.
In response, a group of Zaidi clerics and youth leaders started a cultural revival movement in the northern mountains. They called themselves the Believing Youth.
What did they do initially?
Initially, it was just about running summer camps, teaching religious identity, and resisting the Saudi cultural encroachment.
But as the post-9/11 war on terror ramped up, the Yemeni government aligned closely with the United States. The Believing Youth watched the U.S. invade Iraq and heavily influence their own government, and the movement rapidly radicalized.
They adopted a fiercely anti-American, anti-imperialist ideology. They evolved from a cultural movement into a hardened, armed militia. They became known as the Houthis, named after their founder.
And their slogan is pretty extreme, right?
Their official slogan, which they chant constantly, explicitly includes the phrases "Death to America, Death to Israel."
Throughout the 2000s, they fought a series of brutal, grinding guerrilla wars against the Yemeni central government. The government forces, backed by Saudi Arabia, would bomb the mountains, and the Houthis would retreat to the caves, survive, and strike back.
This constant warfare turned them into incredibly capable, resilient fighters.
So what changed?
In 2014, taking advantage of the political chaos following the Arab Spring, the Houthis made a massive move. They marched out of the mountains and successfully captured the Yemeni capital city of Sana'a, effectively taking control of the country.
And Saudi Arabia watches this happen in absolute horror. The Saudis, now effectively led by the young, ambitious Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, look at their southern border and see a heavily armed militia whose ideology aligns with Iran, taking over an entire country.
They view it as an unacceptable Iranian encirclement.
So in 2015, Saudi Arabia launches a massive military intervention. They assemble a coalition and begin a relentless, devastating bombing campaign against Yemen, heavily utilizing advanced fighter jets and munitions supplied by the United States.
Their goal was to crush the Houthis in a matter of weeks and restore the friendly government.
Instead, it sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The Saudis bombed infrastructure, hospitals, and water treatment plants. They imposed a naval blockade that prevented food and medicine from entering the country, leading to mass starvation and apocalyptic cholera outbreaks. Hundreds of thousands of Yemeni civilians died.
Just a total disaster.
But what was the military result? How did the Houthis survive this onslaught?
They survived through the mechanics of asymmetric warfare. You cannot defeat an entrenched mountain guerrilla force purely with F-15 fighter jets.
The terrain favored them.
Exactly. The Houthis used the rugged geography to their advantage. And critically, this is when Iran really stepped up its support.
How so?
Seeing Saudi Arabia bleeding money and resources in a quagmire, Iran began smuggling highly advanced weapons drone components, ballistic missile parts into Yemen, often on small fishing dhows that slipped past the blockade.
So the Saudi intervention actually achieved the exact opposite of its goal. It took an isolated local militia and transformed them into a battle-hardened, heavily armed, highly capable Iranian proxy with deep operational ties to Tehran.
Exactly. And following the outbreak of war in Gaza after October 7th, the Houthis decided to exert this newly acquired power on the global stage.
Right.
They declared solidarity with the Palestinians and began utilizing those Iranian-supplied drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles to target international commercial shipping passing through the Red Sea.
They are essentially standing on the shore and firing advanced missiles at massive cargo ships, and the geography makes this incredibly potent.
It does.
They are sitting right next to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which literally translates to the Gate of Tears. It is a tiny, narrow choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea. Approximately 30% of all global container ship traffic and a massive portion of Europe's energy supply has to pass through that tiny gap to reach the Suez Canal.
By threatening that single choke point, a rebel militia in one of the poorest countries on Earth managed to force the world's largest shipping companies to reroute entirely around the continent of Africa.
Adding weeks of travel time.
Yes, massively spiking global supply chain costs and effectively holding the global economy hostage.
It's a stunning display of leverage. But what makes the geography of this specific choke point even more fascinating, and honestly a little terrifying, is what is happening right across the water. Roughly 20 miles away.
Right on the other side.
Sitting right on the other side of the Gate of Tears is the tiny, arid country of Djibouti.
Djibouti is a fascinating geopolitical anomaly. It is roughly the size of New Jersey. It has a population of barely 1 million people. It has almost no natural resources, no oil, no minerals.
And very little arable land, right? So they have to import almost all of their food.
Right. So how does a country with no resources survive in one of the most volatile neighborhoods on Earth?
Yeah.
It survives by monetizing its one single asset, unparalleled geopolitical real estate. Djibouti is the gateway to the Red Sea. If you want to protect your shipping lanes from Somali pirates or project power into the Middle East or monitor the Houthis, you need to be in Djibouti.
So the government of Djibouti essentially turned the entire country into a military landlord. They rent out tracts of desert to anyone with a big enough checkbook. And the result is the most concentrated, bizarre collection of rival military forces anywhere on the planet.
It hosts Camp Lemonnier, which is the only permanent United States military base on the entire African continent. Thousands of U.S. troops operate drone strikes and special forces missions out of there.
But if you drive just a few miles down the road from the heavily fortified American base, you hit a massive fortress-like facility that houses the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy.
It is China's first and only overseas military base.
And it doesn't stop there. Japan has its only foreign military base there. The French have a massive historical presence. Italian, Spanish, and German forces all rotate through.
It is exactly like a landlord who owns a massive apartment building and decides to rent out penthouses to the Hatfields and the McCoys.
That's hilarious.
You have these global superpowers who are actively preparing for potential conflict with each other in the Pacific, paying premium rent to share a fence line in the African desert.
The landlord is just collecting checks from both sides, building ports and railways with Chinese money, and providing security logistics for the Americans, all while making them promise not to shoot at each other in the hallways.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. It is a masterclass in playing great powers off each other to ensure your own economic survival. And for the most part, it works because all of these rival superpowers currently share one overriding common interest in that specific location, keeping the shipping lanes open and defeating piracy.
Let's look at the mechanics of this concentration of power. With the U.S. and China basically sharing a fence and the Houthis actively firing ballistic missiles just offshore, does this dense clustering of superpowers make the region more stable? Is it a situation of mutually assured deterrence, where everyone is watching everyone so nobody wants to risk sparking a global war? Or is it a powder keg just waiting for a single accidental spark?
It is a terrifying indicator of a global transition. For the last few decades, we operated under a unipolar, rules-based order managed largely by the hegemony of the United States military.
Right. America was the world police.
Exactly. If there was a problem in the shipping lanes, the U.S. Navy handled it. But the situation in Djibouti proves we have entered a multipolar reality. Great powers are returning to zero-sum geographic competition. China feels it needs its own base to protect its Belt and Road Initiative, rather than relying on American security.
So Djibouti is brilliantly exploiting this multipolar paranoia.
Yes. However, if that global order fractures further, or if a conflict between the U.S. and China erupts over Taiwan, or simply if a Houthi missile accidentally strikes a Chinese warship instead of a commercial freighter, this tiny, resource-poor landlord country could instantly become the epicenter of the next great power clash. It is an incredibly fragile balancing act.
It is a high-stakes game of geopolitical musical chairs. And speaking of high stakes, we have arrived at our final section today. Because underneath all of this conflict, all of this superpower maneuvering, the proxy wars, the choke points, the wealth and relevance of the Middle East for the last century has been built on one single foundation: oil.
The black gold that started our story in the 1930s.
Right. But the fundamental, undeniable reality of the 21st century is that the world is actively, aggressively pivoting away from fossil fuels. We are transitioning to electric vehicles, solar, and wind. The International Energy Agency currently predicts that global demand for oil will hit its absolute peak around the year 2030 and then begin a permanent, irreversible decline.
And the country where our story started, Saudi Arabia, is looking at that timeline with absolute dread.
Why dread?
Because they are a nation whose entire economy, society, and global influence is almost entirely dependent on extracting oil from the ground. It funds their military, it funds their massive public sector, it subsidizes the lavish lifestyle of the royal family.
If the demand for oil drops, the price collapses. And if the oil revenue dries up, their power, their internal stability, the very fabric of their society completely unravels.
They had a massive youth bulge. Millions of young Saudis who need jobs in a post-oil economy. They know the clock is ticking louder every day.
So the current leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is making a desperate, absolute sci-fi gamble to reinvent the kingdom before the money runs out.
Enter
Neom.
The source material outlines this proposed $1.5 trillion mega project located in the remote northwest desert of Saudi Arabia near the Red Sea. It is important to understand that Neom is not just a city. It is an attempt to entirely reinvent their economy, their legal system, and their society from scratch, walled off from the conservative realities of the rest of the country.
The blueprints for this project are genuinely mind-boggling. It sounds like something out of a cyberpunk novel. The centerpiece is the Line, a proposed city that is essentially two massive, parallel mirrored skyscrapers, 500 meters tall, cutting a straight line, 170 kilometers long, straight through the desert and the mountains.
It's insane.
The pitch is that it will house 9 million people, have absolutely no cars, run entirely on 100% renewable energy, and be managed by artificial intelligence.
And that's just one piece. There's also Trojena, a massive mountain resort where they're physically blasting away peaks to build an artificial freshwater lake and deploying incredibly energy-intensive technology to make fake snow so they can host outdoor winter skiing in the middle of the Arabian desert.
Skiing in the desert.
And Oxagon, a massive, fully automated, floating industrial port complex on the Red Sea.
The sheer scale of construction defies logic. The reports from the ground describe an army of tens of thousands of workers, dump trucks, and massive excavators, literally moving mountains of earth 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is a brute force attempt to manifest a utopian, futuristic society into existence through sheer capital expenditure.
But we have to look at the mechanics of how this gets built, because there is a severe, often hidden human cost to this utopia.
Right.
The remote desert where they are building Neom isn't empty. It has been the ancestral home of ancient Bedouin nomadic tribes, specifically the Huwatat tribe, for centuries.
Right, you can't just drop a 170-kilometer mirrored wall onto inhabited land without consequences.
Exactly. To clear the land for this futuristic vision, the Saudi government has forcibly relocated entire villages and tribal communities. And when the locals protested having their ancestral homes bulldozed, the state response was brutal.
The source material details this chillingly. Activists who took to social media to protest the forced evictions have been silenced. In one high-profile case, a local man who posted videos refusing to leave his home was killed in a shootout with state security forces.
That's awful.
Several other villagers who resisted the relocation have been arrested, tried in secretive anti-terrorism courts, and literally placed on death row.
It is a violent, brutal collision between an ancient nomadic past and an authoritarian, forcibly manufactured futuristic vision.
And when you look at the 3D renders and the promotional videos for Neom, it feels less like an urban planning project and more like a massive trillion-dollar startup pitch.
Yeah, pitch deck.
Feels like a blockbuster movie trailer. Saudi Arabia is broadcasting these mind-bending visuals of a utopian future to the global community, desperately trying to generate enough hype to secure the foreign investment and top-tier talent needed to actually shoot the movie.
That is exactly what it is. It's a pitch deck. Because even with their vast sovereign wealth fund, Saudi Arabia cannot afford the $1.5 trillion price tag on their own. If they try to fund it entirely internally, their reserves will eventually dry up. They need international capital to buy into the dream.
So let's look at the underlying logic here. When you see a project, this absurd, a mirrored wall in the desert, fake snow in the Middle East, is this just pure, unchecked, authoritarian hubris? A vanity project of a dictator who surrounds himself with yes-men? Or is it actually a necessary, rational survival tactic? I mean, if your entire national identity and power relies on a resource that the world is actively trying to phase out, do you have to swing for the fences with something this crazy just to shock the system into changing?
It is very easy to dismiss it as pure hubris, and there is certainly an element of ego involved in building the biggest structure in human history. But if you look at the macroeconomic reality, it is born of pure existential dread. It is an absolute necessity. If Saudi Arabia doesn't diversify its economy radically and quickly, the kingdom collapses. It's that simple. They have to transition to becoming a hub for global logistics, luxury tourism, and renewable energy. Now, will the line ever actually stretch for 170 kilometers and house 9 million people? Almost certainly not. The engineering challenges are staggering.
But maybe it doesn't have to.
Precisely. Even if the futuristic city itself is a partial failure, the sheer act of building it forces the country to pivot. If the massive infrastructure investment successfully builds world-class solar and wind farms, if it establishes massive desalination plants, if it trains a new generation of Saudi engineers, and if it successfully brands the country as a destination for global tourism, then the gamble may actually save the kingdom from the end of the oil age.
It's wild.
It is the ultimate, desperate, high-stakes survival strategy masquerading as a sci-fi utopia.
Which brings us to the end of a truly incredible journey through the source material today. We have covered an immense amount of historical and geographic ground. We trace the epic, chaotic story from that sweaty California executive striking oil in the desert in the 1930s, sparking the forbidden alliances that would eventually radicalize Osama bin Laden.
We waded through the bloody World War I-style trenches and cynical superpower double-dealing of the Iran-Iraq War.
We examined the terrifying bureaucratic mechanics of fixing intelligence that led to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and the tragic, cyclical geopolitical betrayal of stateless populations like the Kurds.
We looked closely at the paradox of security, how the strategy of dividing the Palestinians and the invasion of Lebanon birthed the very proxy networks that are threatening the region today.
We explored the modern choke point drama of the Houthis in Yemen, the bizarre superpower landlord state of Djibouti, and finally the trillion-dollar sci-fi mirage of Neom.
It is a dizzying century of history. But if there is one grand, overarching synthesis to draw from all these sources, it is the absolute ironclad law of unintended consequences.
The butterfly effect.
Exactly. Every single time a global superpower stepped into the Middle East to secure resources, prop up a favorable dictator, or forcibly fix a complex problem with military intervention, they inadvertently planted the seeds for the next generation's devastating conflict.
Arming extremists to bleed the Soviets birthed al-Qaeda.
Backing Saddam against Iran necessitated the Gulf War.
Invading Iraq's birthed ISIS.
Managing a divided Gaza shattered on October 7th. The pursuit of short-term tactical control repeatedly, violently backfired into long-term strategic disasters.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. We started this deep dive by looking at a map, comparing the arbitrary borders of the Middle East to lines sliced by a surgeon's scalpel. And for the last 100 years, the blood spilled and the political lines defended in this region have been dictated by the global economy's insatiable thirst for oil.
Foreign powers cared about those lines because they needed the fuel beneath them.
Right. But as we rapidly approach an era of renewable energy, as we hit peak oil demand by 2030, the fundamental strategic calculus of the entire planet changes entirely. So what happens to the Middle East when the great superpowers simply stop caring?
It's the ultimate geopolitical question.
When the oil isn't strictly necessary for global survival, does the region finally, after a century of interference, find the space to organically heal, redraw its own borders, and find its own internal equilibrium? Or does the sudden withdrawal of foreign money, the collapse of rentier economies, and the certain absence of superpower military protection trigger a chaotic collapse more dramatic and violent than anything we've seen so far?
The answer to that question will define the region's next century.
We'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.